All right, let's dive into history. Today, we're tackling the Russian Revolution of 1917.
Ooh, a big one.
Definitely a big one. Whether you're a history buff or just curious about this world-changing event, we're going to break down the causes, the key players, and why it still matters today.
Right.
And we're basing all this on the Russian Revolution, 1917, causes, events, and global impact. You know, most people think of Russia as this superpower, but back then, things were totally different.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting about this period. You picture Russia, this huge imposing force, but in 1917, it was really a nation on the verge of collapse.
So not the intimidating empire we imagine.
Not at all. I mean, geographically, sure, vast empire. But technology, economics, it was lagging way behind. They were struggling to keep up with the modern world.
And to make things even more complicated, they were still ruled by czars, a system that feels like it's straight out of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, an outdated system. It's almost hard to believe they were dealing with modern problems, like industrial worker poverty under such an old system.
It just seems like a recipe for trouble.
It was a recipe for disaster. Huge gap between the ruling elite and the everyday struggles of the people. And then you add devastating losses in the Russo-Japanese War. Millions of Russian soldiers dead, the economy in shambles, people were at a breaking point.
And then you've got Tsar Nicholas II himself.
Yeah.
Makes the decision to lead the army. No real military experience.
Yeah, terrible decision. A major blunder, really. It showed a lack of understanding of the realities of war. And it also, it directly linked him to Russia's military failures.
He became the face of their suffering.
Exactly.
Okay, we have to talk about Rasputin, a mystic influencing the royal family while the country is falling apart. It's like a movie.
The Rasputin story is wild. I mean, it just plays into this sense that the leadership was totally out of touch. Whether his influence was real or just perceived, it didn't matter.
Right. So fast forward to 1917, Petrograd, the capital. Tensions are at a boiling point. What did daily life even look like?
Imagine food shortages, constant lines for basic necessities, and on top of that, fear, grief from the war. It was a powder keg.
And then, boom, the February Revolution. And it all starts with women protesting for bread and peace on International Women's Day.
It's incredible how those protests escalated, citywide strikes. And it wasn't just factory workers, soldiers, ordered to stop them, started joining the protesters.
Oh, wow.
Really shows how quickly things can change, how even the military can turn against the regime.
And suddenly Tsar Nicholas II, who seemed untouchable, is forced to abdicate. Centuries of Romanov rule over.
Just like that. It shows how fragile power really is, especially when leaders don't address the needs of their people.
So the Tsar is out, the provisional government steps in. Seems like a good thing, right?
Well, on the surface, yeah, they promised reforms, a more democratic system. But there's a catch. At the same time, we see Soviets emerging.
Soviets. For those who might not know, what are those?
Sure. Soviets were councils of workers, soldiers, peasants. They represented the working class.
Yeah.
And they emerged as a parallel power structure.
So dual power.
Exactly. Dual power. And you can imagine it created a lot of tension.
And this is where Lenin comes in. Returns from exile in Switzerland. And get this, with help from Germany.
Right, Germany. They were at war with Russia. They saw Lenin as a way to, stir things up, destabilize their enemy.
Clever. But it definitely raises questions about the revolution's independence.
Oh, absolutely. It would cast a shadow over things.
So Lenin shows up with a simple message. Peace, land, bread. It's brilliant.
Oh, incredibly powerful. It tapped into the fundamental needs of the Russian people. They were desperate for change.
And he wasn't just about slogans. He was the leader of the Bolsheviks, radical Marxists who were gaining support fast. But what did they stand for?
Well, to understand the Bolsheviks, you got to understand Marxism. Imagine workers, not wealthy elites, controlling the resources, the means of production.
The base shift.
That's the core of Marx's vision. And the Bolsheviks turned it into a revolutionary movement. They wanted to overthrow the system, create a truly equal society.
So you have this shaky provisional government, this grassroots power in the Soviets, and the rise of the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
It's all setting the stage for a major showdown.
And it's coming. What we call the October Revolution, it wasn't some random uprising. This was planned. A takeover orchestrated by Trotsky and the Red Guards, the Bolsheviks militia.
Like a chess game.
Exactly. They took control of key points in Petrograd, the Winter Palace, and with very little resistance. The provisional government, already weak, just crumbled. The Bolsheviks, with their vision and their organization, they were now in charge.
So they take power, the Bolsheviks. But it doesn't just end there, right?
No, not at all. The October Revolution, it was really just the beginning. Russia was thrown into this brutal civil war. It lasted for years.
Wow.
The Bolsheviks, or the Reds, they were fighting against all sorts of opponents, a whole coalition known as the Whites.
And then, on top of everything else, other countries get
Oh,
involved.
absolutely.
Yeah.
This internal conflict, it became a proxy war. You had Britain, France, the U.S., they were backing the Whites. And Germany, well, at least at first, they saw an advantage in supporting the Bolsheviks. It just added fuel to the fire, you know?
Turning a domestic struggle into an international one, it's hard to imagine how chaotic it must have been. And then, amidst all this, the Romanov family is executed.
Yeah, the Tsar, his wife, their 5 children, it was brutal. Sent shockwaves around the world.
It wasn't just eliminating a rival, he was symbolic, right?
Oh, totally. A complete break with the past. A demonstration of the new regime's power.
It's a dark side of revolutions. And the violence didn't end there. There's also the Red Terror, this campaign of repression and executions.
Anyone seen as a threat to the Bolshevik government.
Wow.
It's a tragic example of how revolutionary ideals can be twisted. I mean, they promised freedom and equality, but they resorted to terror to stay in power.
Silencing anyone who disagreed. So the revolution succeeds, but at a huge cost. And this impact, it wasn't just contained to Russia, right? What happened next?
Well, the Russian Revolution, it had this ripple effect across the globe. The Bolsheviks created a communist state, and it inspired other movements in other countries.
It's like it planted a seed that then spread.
Exactly, like in China and Cuba. Communist revolutions there too, new regimes established based on, at least in theory, Marxist principles. The world was changing.
And it set the stage for the Cold War, didn't it? That rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
For sure. The Russian Revolution was a major factor in that. It established this communist superpower, directly challenging the West. And it led to, well, proxy wars, arms races, fear of nuclear war.
It's amazing how one event could have such a huge impact on the entire 20th century. And beyond the politics, were there changes within Russia itself?
Absolutely. Russia became this, testing ground for social and economic ideas. The Bolsheviks wanted to create a socialist utopia, so they implemented big changes. State-controlled. Well, basically, the government took control of private land, forced farmers to work in these collective units.
A huge change.
Huge. The idea was to increase efficiency, but often it just led to chaos, resistance, and even famine.
It's a lot to process. And even with all its impact, the Russian Revolution is still controversial. Was it inevitable? Could Russia have modernized peacefully?
It's a big debate. Some historians say the Tsarist regime was just too flawed, too resistant to change. They point to the inequality, the Tsar's rule, his failure to adapt.
So, in their view, revolution was the only way.
Yeah, they might say it was necessary. Even though it led to so much suffering, it paved the way for progress, even if it was slow and came at a cost.
But others think peaceful reform was possible.
Right. They say other countries managed to modernize and democratize without revolutions. They argue that the Tsar stepping down, the provisional government, it showed they were willing to reform.
But the Bolsheviks, with their radical ideas, sort of hijacked the movement.
That's their argument. And then there's the question of Lenin himself. Did he betray the revolution? Did he stray from Marxist ideals?
It's a complicated question.
It really is. Some see Lenin as a visionary. You know, tough choices, but ultimately he saved the revolution, laid the foundation for a more just society.
They might say his methods were necessary, given the circumstances.
Exactly. Civil war, foreign intervention, a collapsing economy. He had to be tough to ensure the new regime survived. They might point to his ability to adapt Marx's ideas to Russia, his commitment to the working class.
But then there are those who see him as a betrayer.
Oh, for sure. They say his centralized control, his crackdown on dissent, the violence against his own people, that's not what Marx envisioned.
So he became what he was fighting against, another authoritarian.
That's their argument. They say he laid the groundwork for Stalin's totalitarian regime.
It's a mixed legacy. And we can't forget the human cost. Millions dead.
The human cost was immense. The suffering, the loss of life. It's a reminder that revolutions, even with good intentions, can have terrible consequences.
So looking back, what can we learn from all of this? What makes it relevant today?
Well, one big takeaway is that you can't ignore public discontent. The Tsar, he learned that the hard way.
So even in democracies, we have to listen to the people, address their concerns.
Exactly. And leadership matters. Lenin's personality, his ideology, his strategies, they all shaped the revolution. It makes you wonder, what if someone else was in charge?
It's always interesting to think about those what-ifs. And I guess a Russian Revolution also shows us that even well-intentioned revolutions can go wrong, and quickly.
That's right. And it highlights the need for good governance after a revolution. How do you rebuild? How do you create a just and stable system? These are still relevant questions. We see revolutions happening around the world today.
And the Russian Revolution, it had this ripple effect, showing that these things don't stay contained.
Exactly. The world is interconnected. What happens in one place impacts others, for better or worse.
And it makes you wonder, could something like this happen again? Are there, like, warning signs we should be looking for?
That's a good question, a really important one. The Russian Revolution, it was specific to its time, but it also has these universal lessons about power and inequality and how much people want change.
Yeah.
It shows us what happens when systems break down, when leaders lose touch, when the people in charge just cling to the old ways and ignore, well, everyone else.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Russian Revolution, I'm thinking about Russia in 1917, a nation kind of on the edge, hope for a better future, but also dealing with so much struggle in the present.
Right. It was a time of incredible suffering, but also like amazing courage. People risked everything for a chance at a better life, for themselves, for their kids, their grandkids. It's kind of inspiring, that human spirit, that belief that change is possible, even radical change.
And even though the revolution, it didn't achieve all its goals, it's still so fascinating, isn't it? People are still debating it. It reminds us that history is not just dates and names, it's a story that shapes how we see the world.
I agree. The Russian Revolution, it makes us ask these big questions about power and revolution and how societies change. And it forces us to look at, well, the darker side of humanity, how even good causes can get twisted, how good intentions can, lead to bad things.
It's like a reminder that history isn't always progress. There are setbacks, unintended consequences, and the choices we make today, they'll impact tomorrow.
For sure. The echoes of the Russian Revolution, we still feel them. New political movements, debates about inequality, social justice, the role of government. It's a cautionary tale, but also kind of inspiring.
Yeah, it shows us that change is possible, even if it's hard, when people band together and demand something better.
Right.
So we'll leave you with this. What are the lessons of the Russian Revolution for us today? What can we learn from the past? How can we work towards a just world without repeating those mistakes?
Important questions. Things to think about, talk about, debate. Because when we understand the past, the good and the bad, we can handle the present better. And we can maybe build a future where, those mistakes aren't repeated.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Russian Revolution. We could talk about this for days, but we encourage you to keep learning, keep digging into the history and all the different viewpoints.
The fascinating period.
It is. And understanding the past, it helps us navigate the present and build a better future. So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and stay curious.